The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the October 2020 CIECAST CIECA Technical Series 2021 R1 release. I'm Paul Berry, Executive Director of CIECA. The Collision Industry Electronic Commerce Association, or CIECA, develops and promotes electronic communication standards that allow the collision industry to be more efficient. We also provide webinars like this one to keep the industry informed of updates to the standards. Today's presenters are Paulette Reed, Technical Project Manager for CIECA, and Dan Webster, Principal Architect for Mitchell International. As we start the webinar, I want to remind you there is no verbal communication between the participants and the presenters. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it in the question panel on the webinar screen. We will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Now I'll turn the program over to Paulette.
Hello, everyone. I'm Paulette Reed, CIECA Technical Project Manager. I work with all of our committees to go over what is in a release, and I wanted to give a brief overview before we started what was in the 2021 R1 content of how our release cycles work. A quick introduction is that CIECA has 2 releases per year. We schedule these for the 3rd Wednesday of April and the 3rd Wednesday of October. And we just had our first release of this year, our 2021 R1, and that was yesterday on April 21st. If you need to get content into a release, we have numerous channels to do that. A CIECA member can request a change by simply contacting anyone on the CIECA staff, and you can do that through our CIECA emails or through CIECA.com. You can go to the contact section, and that will generate an email to us. Another way that we have to get content into our release is our semi-annual meetings. These meetings are usually scheduled around the end of our releases, and we request any updates from our current members and our chairs to see if we have anything that needs to go into the next release. Then another avenue is our active committees. When we're meeting weekly, monthly, and whatever the active committee schedules may be, we might identify areas that we need to add to the release. So those are all ways that we can get content into a release. Once we receive a request, the CIECA staff will do some analysis, document the request, and then determine what standards development committee needs to work on this request. So we can assign that to an active committee, or we can activate a maintenance mode committee, and we can also create a new committee. So this year we created the new committee with the Emerging Technologies Data Standards Committee. And anytime that we need a new standards development committee, our CIECA board needs to approve that committee. Quick overview of after it is approved, we will assign it to a committee. Those committees will review all the documents after the requirements are gathered. We have our implementation guides. The implementation guides are our high level, our workflows, and our high level business concepts. Then we have our Appendix C documentation, which is our business use cases. We have our BMS, which handles all of our business management suite standards. We have our code list, and then we have test instances for all of our BMS and code list. Once those are approved through a committee, they are sent to the Standards Advisory Board Committee for any of the documentation, and the Architecture Committee for any technical approval. So the Standards and Advisory Board reviews and approves the Appendix Cs, the implementation guides, which include the workflows, and then our Architecture Committee approves the BMS changes, our code list, and our test instances to make sure that all the technical changes that we're making go with the architectural guidelines and CIECA standards that are documented. At this time, the SAB board or the Architecture Committee can send it back to the committee with questions. They can meet as a group, or we can get approval. Once we have approval, the schemas are created or updated based off of the changes that were made to BMS. We have the test instances are created and updated to make sure that everything is tested. The code list and the database is generated. We run a build to build this and package all of this information together. And then we execute the test instances to make sure that we did not break anything and validate that everything has been tested. Once that is successful, we send this to QA. In our QA process, we try to have QA at least 2 weeks prior to a release. This allows us to find anything that may come up in a release, any questions, and take that back to a committee, the architecture, or the SAB, and get that resolution. And so our process, we will look at any changes that was made to the BMS, make sure that it falls within the architecture guidelines. Once that is approved, we validate that the schema is in line. All the changes that made in the BMS are made into the schema. These two documents are always in sync. Then we have our code list QA, just to verify our spelling and make sure that we follow any architectural guidelines that we have in our code list. After that, we make sure that we have test instances that validate all of the BMS schema and code list changes. We have a spell check process to make sure, as you all know, XML, all of our tags are scrunched together in one word. So we make sure all the words are individually spelled correctly with this spell check process. And after that, we vote for approval, and we can move it into our release forward after the approval of the QA. To find this information, you can go out to CIECA.com to our standards and tools. You must be logged in to be able to see the BMS release, IG, and instant documents, and you will be able to find our latest release and all the other releases. So if you want to look at past releases documentation, you can do that as well. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Webster, which is our chairman of our CIECA Architecture Committee, and he can go over the changes for the Architecture Committee's 2021 R1 release.
Thank you, Paulette. So there I was very quickly. So Paulette will take over again shortly and talk about the functional changes that were requested by the Salvage Committee. But before we get there, I'll talk about something that was done just for architecture and for QA. So in the EMS standard years ago, the same code list was shared between the part types and labor types and totals. And we didn't do that within the BMS. We have separate tables for those, and yet we expect those lists to correlate and have all of the part types also represented in the total types, and same with rates, labor, and other charges. And we have found one by one over the years that we've missed a few of those, or worse yet, sometimes we had one of the matching codes from those coordinating lists were already taken for something else. So Paulette herself undertook a comprehensive correlation of all these lists and came back to us throughout the 6 months between this release and the last one, and found a number of things to be changed. And she brought that to the Architecture Committee and made recommendations to correct it. And for the affected committees, we told them what we had found and what we had done. And that was finally all put together and approved in our release that we're talking about today, which went really smoothly, probably the best QA process we've done so far in my time with the Architecture Committee and with CIECA. The details are here. We had 8 codes from the correlating list that were added to the part type code list, 46 to the rate type list, 34 for total type, 7 for labor type, 19 from the correlating list were added to the other charges list. And then we looked at the existing part type PAL, which we had allowed to take on a new definition sometime in the last couple of years. And we made a decision to restore its original description. The existing code ROE for recycled original equipment is going to be deprecated, and the not to use trademark codes in the code list in future. The new code PRCY for parts recycled parts will be added to the part type, rate type, and total type code list. You see now we're going to get away from having to do this effort again because we put it in all the lists at the same time. And similarly, we did that for a new PRO, parts recycled original equipment, was added to all those things. The other thing we do is create test instances that use the new codes in the way that they're intended, and then we validate those. And that was all added, and it's part of an automated process as Paulette described. And we went through all of these changes. We made instances to demonstrate that we understood how they were all to be used, and then we proved it by validating with the new schema.
Thank you, Dan, for all of your help with our QA and our architecture committee and presenting today. I'm going to take back over and talk about the 2021 R1 request that the Salvage Committee made. In our semi-annual meeting going into this release, it was asked that we would implement the disposition inquiry message. This message was implemented in our BMS already, but we did not have it in the implementation guides. And as a concept, we would want all of our messages that we use to be inside of our implementation guides. So the reason this request was made was because some salvage providers do not save all the status message details in their systems. And if this inquiry message will allow the salvage provider to inquire on a disposition inquiry, and the salver can respond to that inquiry with those status message details. The details of this request was we added and implemented the disposition inquiry request to the implementation guides. We added and implemented the disposition inquiry response to the implementation guides. The implementation disposition workflow was added to the implementation guides, which is as well. And then we had the BMS was not changed in the schema. Well, the BMS already had the messages, but we needed to have that service info aggregate, which was an existing aggregate. We needed to add that to the disposition responses. So that was changed to the BMS and to the schemas. We added a new code list to document subtype to say release issue, so we can identify that this inquiry was with a release issue. And again, as we stated earlier, that we created the test instances to validate the new disposition inquiry request and the disposition inquiry response with the new code list addition as well. At this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Dan as he's going to give an update as to some of the other work that happened during the last 6 months with our CIECA API initiative.
Okay, thanks, Paulette. So the Architecture Committee has less to do in recent years when the BMS has become more mature. So we get the occasional new messages, as you saw Paulette just presented, but we're looking for the next generation. Actually, it has already found us. It's going to use JSON, the JavaScript object notation, and the REST standard for communicating messages. And the Architecture Committee is getting really active on this after not making so much progress for the last few years when we called it a JSON committee. So that the Architecture Committee is the one that is pursuing this. We're getting good participation in the last quarter, and we're working on creating the JSON guidelines and the guidelines for using the Open API standard specification. We've got new tooling and some contributors to the architecture committee who are well versed in them. And we're using GitHub and Swagger Hub for source control and the authoring and presentation of open API specs. One of the first things we've done is taken the simple types that we invented and have used for XML over the decades and making a JSON version of that. And it's not just copying or converting it to JSON, but also trying to get a feel for what the industry standard best practices are for using JSON. And we're doing these at the same time, making sure we can convert all our messages and do it in a way that looks native or like folks that are familiar with JSON are expecting to do it. Similarly, we've got the common aggregates that we've always used in the XML schemas for the last decades, and we're now calling those JSON domains. And we're trying to keep this simpler than it's gotten to be, using a number of strategies to do that. And we hope by the next time we're reporting to you, we will have had some progress on the first notice of loss JSON message. So we're taking one of the very, very many messages that and services that CIECA has in the VMS, and we're going to test one of them out using the new technologies and best practices that we're talking about, and that's going to be the FNOL messages. So that is our progress on the CIECA Open API initiative, and we're always looking for contributors or folks who are interested in what we're doing to participate in the architecture committee. Thank you.
Thank you again, Dan. And if you would like to be part of this Open API update with the architecture committee, please reach out to me and I can get you added into that committee invitation. So at this time, Lisa, do we have any questions?
No, we don't have any questions, but this is recorded, and if anyone has questions later, feel free to reach out to any of us.
Great, thank you. Well, please don't forget to check CIECA.com for a full schedule of future broadcasts and to watch recordings of past webinars. Links are available under the CIECAST tab at the top of the page. CIECA has partnered with the Automotive Management Institute. Attendees of this webinar are eligible to receive credit toward the professional designation from AMI after taking a short quiz on its website. A link will be sent to all attendees. And finally, please follow CIECA's social media platforms to stay up to date on upcoming events and CIECA news. Thank you, Paulette. Thank you, Dan, for taking time this morning to share this information. This concludes today's webinar.